Joining us now is Alex Dupuy. He is a professor of sociology at Wesleyan University, and he joins us on the line now from New Haven, Connecticut. Professor Dupuy, comment ça va ce soir? How are you tonight?
Very well, thank you.
I took the liberty of speaking a tiny bit of your native French. I guess you're originally from Haiti, but we'll continue henceforth in English if you don't mind. We wanted you on the program tonight
fine.
because your knowledge of Haiti will be helpful to us in understanding some of the building blocks that we need better understood in order to try to figure out where Haiti goes from here. For example, let me take you back to the country's birth, when it became independent in 1804. What were the pillars of the Haitian economy at that time?
Primarily agriculture. Haiti was the largest sugar producer in the Caribbean, in the New World, during the 18th century. But during the Revolution, much of the sugar production, took a turn. That is to say, it went downward. It wasn't sustained at the same level after the Revolution, and most of Haiti became transformed into a sort of self-subsistent economy. Coffee supplanted sugar in the 19th century as a major export crop. And most of the country most of the population lived in the rural areas of agriculture, and basically on the basis of a small-scale farming for domestic production, with, as I mentioned before, coffee as a primary export.
Now, the country later went into a serious economic decline. Maybe you could help us understand what some of the main factors were in that decline.
Well, I think, throughout the 19th century, Haiti never developed an industrial infrastructure. It remained primarily an agricultural economy, and today it's still primarily an agricultural economy. But when the United States came to occupy Haiti from 1915 to 1934, that was the beginning, if you will, of the introduction of larger scale productive sectors. And later on in the 1970s, there began the introduction of the export assembly industries that became one of the major manufacturing sectors in Haiti.
Well, let me jump in there because I want to pursue that with you. Anybody who followed Major League Baseball, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago will remember that if they knew nothing else about Haiti, they knew that those baseballs were made in Haiti. What did that American influence and the assembly line process, manufacturing that was brought to bear in the country, how did that assist the country moving forward economically at the time?
Well, in many ways, it really didn't help the country move economically forward. It provided jobs, but those jobs were based primarily on the cheapest labor in the Caribbean, and that was what attracted the investors into Haiti at the insistence of the World Bank and the IMF and other aid donors, who thought that Haiti could be made into a major producer of these assembly, textile, baseball, some electronic components for export. But the problem with that is that other than providing labor, the Haitian economy had no other inputs into these industries. All the technology, the raw materials would be imported from the outside, and Haitian entrepreneurs would build the factories and enter into a contract with the foreign investors and employ Haitian labor and produce on the basis of a quota that they would assign these industries primarily for the U.S. market. So that industry neither had a great deal of flexibility in terms of being able to expand production beyond the quota, and the only contribution it made to the Haitian economy were basically the wages that it paid to the managers and the labor force primarily. Of course, there was some spillover in terms of providing access to some services, transportation, restaurants and so on, and food for the workers in the assembly industries. And it led to some housing construction in the immediate areas of those industries. But by and large, the contribution to those economies was minimal.
Well, let me take you to agriculture, because of course the weather there you would think would be terrific for all of the agricultural products that one would want to make down there. Now, what's been the problem? How come it hasn't worked that way?
Well, there are many factors explaining why the agricultural sector went into a decline. But soil erosion was one factor. The lack of support on the part of the government for the agricultural sector, the rather small size of the land that the farmers cultivated, but one of the main factors that affected Haiti, again, in my view, was the opening up the Haitian economy to foreign imports. And that happened particularly in the 1980s with the trade liberalization measures coming out again of the advanced industrial countries, the US and the international financial institutions, which insisted that Haiti would open its markets for food imports. The consequence of that, of course, was that Haitian farmers could not compete with cheaper imports from abroad. So as a result, Haiti went from a situation where in the early 70s, it was late 60s, early 70s, it was nearly self-sufficient in the food that it produced and consumed. It imported maybe about 10% of its food needs to a situation where today Haiti is importing 60% of its food needs and about 80% of its rice, which is a staple crop for the economy, but yet Haiti was self-sufficient in rice production in the early 70s.
Paul Collier, who's been on this program before, you know him well, I'm sure, from, here's a piece that he did for the New York Times last month. He, of course, the special advisor on Haiti and the author of The Bottom Billion, about the poorest people in the world. The Hope II Trade Pact with the United States, he wrote, signed in 2008, granted Haiti duty-free access to the American apparel market for the next decade. Already, as a result of the deal, many garment factories situated along Haiti's eastern border, so as to use Dominican electricity and ports, have become profitable and competitive with Chinese garment makers. But light manufacturing could be much bigger in Haiti if the Haitian government and donors would credibly commit to providing functioning roads, electrical grids, and ports, and if outside private capital would invest patiently in Haitian businesses. Now, he seems to think more free trade zones ought to be a priority in Haiti. What do you say to that?
Right. What I say to that is that Collier basically ignored the evidence of the past 38 years in Haiti, because had he looked at seriously, had he done a serious evaluation of the consequences of the assembly industries sector, then he would have found that it really did not create the panacea that the World Bank had hoped it would in the 70s when it pushed that as an alternative for Haiti. And for the reasons that I've stipulated, basically that industry relies on cheap labor. It contributes virtually nothing to the Haitian economy. So yes, it would be a boon to the investors. It would be certainly help increase the wealth of the Haitian elites who are the entrepreneurs who invest in those industries. It might create more employment for the population. But as long as wages remain below poverty level, it's not going to contribute much in terms of building a viable economic alternative for the majority of Haitians. At its height in the 70s, that industry employed about 8% of the industrial labor force. And today, that industry produces less in terms of the GNP than do the remittances that Haitians send back to Haiti from Canada, from the US, and other places where they emigrated to.
Well, let's do one tangible example here if we can. I've read in numerous places now that Haitians make great mangoes, that the climate works, that the quality of the mango in Haiti is terrific. And yet the world doesn't know it. There's no great mango export market, for example. Why aren't they getting their mangoes out to the world?
Well, again, it's probably for the lack of support, both in terms of the quality of the mangoes that are being produced, but also access to other markets. You know, there's a great deal of competition in terms of where mangoes are coming from, and so a lot of that also has to do with U.S. policy, import policies. But now, mangoes, sure, Haiti could produce mangoes for export. It could increase the production of mangoes for export. But if that is the only sector that is targeted for improvement, that's not necessarily going to help bring Haiti back to a situation of near food self-sufficiency. Because if you emphasize mangoes, much like if you emphasize the assembly industries, you're not necessarily going to want encourage investment, support investment in other sectors that could provide more meaningful and long-lasting jobs for the Haitian population and contribute more to the overall, a more balanced economic development for the economy.
Let's take our remaining moments and talk about what you think the priorities should be going forward now. Let's do a little blue skying here. Let us assume that we are far enough down the road that the initial, let's just make sure whoever's alive is saved. Let's try to make sure that the people who can be treated are treated. We're past that point now. We're now at the point where the country and the world have to consider what the top development priorities ought to be. So make a list. What should they be?
Well, to me, that priority must be established by the Haitian government in response to the needs and interests of the majority of Haitians. And to me, the priority ought to be to target the agricultural sector for substantial investment to build the infrastructure, roads and transportation networks and markets and so on that Collier talks about, but also to support the Haitian agriculture to rejuvenate that sector, to make it more viable for the 66% of the population who live off agriculture. And if that means imposing significant tariffs on certain types of foods, then so be it. That would have to be done. Indeed, most of the major countries protect their agricultural sector with heavy tariffs. So I think that's what Haiti should also do. I also think, of course, that education needs to be made a priority. Healthcare needs to be made a priority, because without a healthy population, and that goes beyond 55 years of age in terms of life expectancy, and without a population that's more educated and more skilled, it's going to be difficult to generate meaningful economic development. So to me, I would target the agricultural sector, or I would certainly also support major infrastructure development and invest heavily in education, healthcare, and jobs for the population, public sector jobs, such as is being advocated in the form of a Marshall Plan. But to me, a Marshall Plan that would be indeed expanding and bringing the Haitian infrastructure to modern standards.
Well, in fact, we have heard numerous references, I guess, in the media lately to a kind of a, post-World War II, the whole world pitches in Marshall Plan. Do you think that could work right now, given how devastated the society is?
Sure. If it was planned properly, if it was done in terms of having the interest of not just rebuilding Port-au-Prince, but also by investing in the other urban centers of Haiti, so that Port-au-Prince does not become what has been known in Haiti as the Republic of Port-au-Prince, as the only major hub where all major activities, economic activities, take place. So if there is a divestment, if there is a decentralization in the investments in rebuilding the infrastructure, hospitals, schools, industries, the agro-industrial industries and other kinds of industries that could use both Haitian labor and Haitian inputs to produce goods for both the consumer and export markets, then that would benefit, that would be the beginning of a serious reconstruction of the Haitian economy.
Alex Dupuy from Wesleyan University. Good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.